let's turn our attention back to the Bible and Revelation 7. I know you've talked
back
about
to your
it
encrypted introduction.
Yeah. I wish I had some backwards.
Yeah.
You know, my name is Yurt backwards. Does that mean anything? Yurt. Kind of sounds.
Well, there is. I don't know if it's the correct spelling, but there are such things as yurts. Is that what you're talking about?
Is that like the tents? The little circle tents?
Yeah, those round.
Yeah,
I think they're
yurts.
round. Yeah, round.
I was hoping something more powerful, like.
Right.
Yeah. But
it's not terribly exotic.
Well, if I'm a circle tent, that's not as exciting. But.
Ooh, yeah. Yeah, you're a circle tent. Wow, I'm impressed.
Yeah. It's not very.
Yeah.
I'm going to need you to come up with some kind of Hebrew meaning.
Yeah, Hebrew word for yurt.
Yeah. Well, actually, I guess I'm just a number 3. Trey stands for 3, so.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm just 3. But we're in Revelation 7.
It's not quite gematria, but we'll take it.
Yeah, we're in Revelation 7 today, Mike. So, what more are you going to teach us about the 144,000 today?
Well, this is part 1, which obviously means we're going to need more time. Don't know yet if we're going to get 3. We're going to get at least 2, obviously. In this episode, we're going to tackle a few sort of, I guess, transparently obvious questions when it comes to, again, repurposing the Old Testament and whatnot. And then in the next episode, we'll get into some of the odder stuff that I've actually written a little bit about, like why is Dan missing from the list of tribes and all that stuff. So we'll get back into that sort of thing and a little bit of interpretive stuff and even here, there's going to be some of that too. But this is what the passage is known for: 144,000. First 8 verses. This is the first of 2 listings of the 144,000, or 2 sections of the book of Revelation that spend any time on them. And so this is what everybody thinks of when you hit Revelation 7. And again, I did, write about this before a little bit in Reversing Hermon. We're going to go beyond that, both in this episode and the next episode. So today we're not going to necessarily get into that or how the story, here's a teaser, how the text, the 144,000 may indeed factor into the Watcher story. Again, I talk about that in Reversing Hermon, but that's for part 2. But again, we'll get a little more detail than we devoted to it there. So let's, for today, just jump into the passage, the first 8 verses. And again, I'm reading from ESV. It says, "After this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, that no wind might blow on the earth or sea or against any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun with the seal of the living God, and he called with a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to harm earth and sea, saying, 'Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads.' And I heard the number of the sealed, 144,000, sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel." And then you get the list, 12,000 from Judah, Reuben, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Simeon, Levi, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin are the 12 tribes in the next 4 verses. They all are 12,000, and they are, quote unquote, sealed. Now, a couple general observations, because we're focused here on what John is doing with the Old Testament. The obvious ones are the tribes and the numbers. Okay, so let's just start with the numbers. What about all this counting? What does it remind you of in the Old Testament? Well, the answer is kind of obvious. It reminds you of census counting. I mean, you get these lists of tribes numbered in the Old Testament, like the book of Numbers. What a surprise. That's immediately sort of what you think of. Now, in his Revelation commentary, this is again volume 2, Revelation 6 through 16, he writes this. He says, "The census is a specific form of list that occurs with some frequency in the Old Testament, where it is used for purposes of taxation." One example, Exodus 30, 11 through 16. Or for labor conscription, 2 Chronicles 2, 17 and 18. For determining the cultic duties and social structure of members of the tribe of Levi, that's Numbers 3 and 4. For determining Israelite descent, you get it in Ezra 2. But most commonly, he says, it is used as a means for determining military strength. And this is Numbers chapter 1, verses 2 through 46. Again, very obvious parallel, if you want to, or kind of a source text for that. Now that suggests, Owen writes, that the census in Revelation 7, 4 through 8 is for military purposes. And that might be a bit of an overstatement, but you could see it in the context of Revelation. And this is where Owen goes. I mean, he lists all these other things that don't really fit. So bad things are coming on, with boots on the ground and all this sort of stuff, lots of conflict. It's an apocalyptic text. So this is a reasonable deduction. Again, he suggests that the census in Revelation 7, 4 through 8 is for military purposes, a possibility that is partially confirmed by the present literary context of this pericope, since, according to Revelation 14, that's the second mention of the 144,000, according to Revelation 14, 3 and 4, the group of 144,000 consists exclusively of adult males who practice sexual abstinence, an ancient Israelite requirement for holy warriors. Again, we're going to get into the characterization of them being male virgins next week, and we get into more Levitical connections, possibly again having to do with the story of the Book of the Watchers in Enoch. But again, just store that away. For now, again, Owen is noting that this was kind of the practice before as one of the preparations for war. If you didn't have sex with your wife, that sort of thing. So again, he's saying this suggests we have a military context. But he also adds, however, the absence of all military and holy war imagery from Revelation 7, 4 through 8 makes this suggestion doubtful. And so he's pulling back a little bit. The author's insistence on an equal number, 12,000, from each of 12 tribes indicates his interest is in the eschatological restoration of the 12-tribe nation of Israel. The eschatology of the late Old Testament and early Jewish periods emphasized the hope of the restoration of Israel. It's Deuteronomy 30, verses 3 and 5, Isaiah 11, 11 through 16, and lots of passages here. Ezekiel 37, 15 to 23 is sort of a favorite on this podcast. Again, he gives you 10, 15 references here to this hope of the restoration of Israel. And specifically, a number of these texts have all 12 tribes included. So that's Owen's, assessment. He angles for the military thing, points that out. Okay, you can see that, but then he backs away and says, restoration seems like a better way to go here. And that's actually going to go better, with what where we'll land next week when we hit the whole thing about the characterization of the 144,000 as sexual virgins and male virgins and all that stuff. Bauckham also sort of pushes back on the holy war or the military context in his article, The Book of Revelation as a Christian War Scroll. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls as we were chatting before the episode, but one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the more famous ones from the original truckload, is something called the War Scroll. It's 1QM, and this is an apocalyptic war between, I like the phrase gods and men, but you have angels and angelic beings and humans fighting on both the good side and the bad side. That's why it's known as the War Scroll, set in the end times. So Bauckham has this article comparing the Book of Revelation to the War Scroll, and again, calling the Book of Revelation a Christian War Scroll. Now, I've put this article in the protected folder just for anybody who's interested in it. We're not going to go point by point through it, but just so that you have access to it. So Bauckham, though, he says it's a more fruitful trajectory to think about the tribes as opposed to this sort of faint military imagery. So he's going to agree with On. He doesn't really, he acknowledges the military element is there, but doesn't find it that persuasive. So let's talk about the tribes. So this is the second thing that stands out, the tribes and the tribal arrangement. So Bauckham writes this. He says, the list of the 12 tribes in Revelation 7 has several peculiarities which require comment. That's an understatement, believe me. First, the order of the list corresponds to no other extant list of the tribes, period, in the Bible. Okay, this one's unique in terms of its order. Most significant, Bauckham writes, is the fact that Judah heads the list. This is true of Old Testament lists in which the tribes are arranged geographically, moving from south to north, for instance, Numbers 34:19, Joshua 21:4, so on and so forth. But the list in Revelation 7 bears no other resemblance to any of these geographical lists. The only other Old Testament list of tribes which puts Judah first is that of Numbers 2, verse 3, followed by Numbers 7, 12, and 10, 14. That is, the tribes in their military order in the camp. So again, here he is now making this comment about there's a military flavoring to this, but then Bauckham says, but again, the rest of the order of tribes in Revelation 7 bears no resemblance to the list of Numbers 2. And again, he has this, his own pushback about, okay, there's some military stuff in here, but not enough to make him or Owen, of course, think that this is really what it's about. I don't think we should lose the military context personally. I think it does fit with spiritual warfare. But again, that's for part 2 with the whole Watcher story. I think there's a reason why we get some military sprinkles in the text. But continuing on with Bauckham. So he says that's one peculiarity. The order of the list corresponds to no other extant list of the tribes. Number 2, the inclusion of both Joseph and Manasseh. This is Revelation 7, 6, and 8. Rather than either Joseph alone or Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, let me just stop there. Ephraim and Manasseh were Joseph's two boys. And so after they're sort of grafted into Israel, the Genesis 48 scene with Jacob, crossing the hands and all that, after they are adopted essentially by Israel, by Jacob, you will often see Ephraim and Manasseh occupying the Joseph slot in the list of tribes. But here you get both Joseph and Manasseh, like what happened to Ephraim. Bauckham actually says here, this is unparalleled and has never been explained. Thanks for that. Then he goes on and he says, a possibility is that the author had in mind Ezekiel 37, 15 through 23, the classic Old Testament prophecy of the reunion of the 12 tribes in the Messianic kingdom. In the extant text of Ezekiel 37, 16, and 19, the name Joseph has been glossed. There's an explanatory item in these verses. The name Joseph has been glossed with phrases referring to Ephraim in such a way that the reader could think that Joseph is here being used as a name for the tribe of Ephraim. Joseph might therefore seem a suitable name for Ephraim in the list of the tribes in the eschatological reunited Israel. So let me just stop there. So Bauckham's saying it's really unusual, and it's unprecedented actually, that you have Joseph and Manasseh in a tribal list and you don't have Ephraim. Then he, to summarize what he's saying, well, if you go back in the Old Testament, you're going to find in Ezekiel 37, you're going to find references to Joseph there because Ezekiel 37, the context is the reunification of the tribes. You're going to find Joseph there, but Joseph is talked about in ways that would be associated with Ephraim elsewhere in the Old Testament. So maybe a reader of John's Apocalypse, when he encounters Joseph in the list, will think Ephraim, and therefore you sort of have Ephraim and Manasseh. You have this expected symmetry. Okay, that's a guess, but and Bauckham admits it's a guess. He says this has never really been explained by anybody. There you go. Maybe that's what's going on. Third anomaly is the tribe of Levi. Revelation 7:7 might seem out of place in a military census. It was excluded from the 2 Mosaic censuses. It's hard to say, censuses. In Numbers 1:41, Numbers 2:33, Numbers 26, 1 through 51. Okay, Levi isn't included. Remember, the census in Numbers was, again, this is for warfare because they're going to go in and, that the conquest is going to start. We're going to take the land and all that. But the priestly tribe was excluded from that. But here they're included. It's just a little odd. I mean, in the book of Numbers, they do get numbered, but not as part of the military, engagement party. Okay, and they're not part of the military forces. Bauckham adds, however, in 1 QM, that's the war scroll from Qumran, although the priests and Levites do not fight with weapons, they play an essential part in the conduct of war, conducting prayers before, during, and after battle, and blowing the trumpets, which both direct the troops and call divine attention to the battle. Without them, the war could not be a holy war, so they have to participate in some way, he says. Consequently, the tribe of Levi is organized on the same military pattern as the other tribes, in the war scroll anyway, 1 QM 4, 1 through 8. and can be said to fight, in this way. Again, this is sort of like spiritual warfare, which I think is the more fruitful trajectory for all of this. So those are, again, Baucham's, three anomalies that he notes right away when it comes to the tribes. He could have added, well, he does add, I'll just include it here, even though we're going to talk about it next time. Fourth, the omission of Dan. Okay, the tribe of Dan is not in the list in Revelation 7 or later. So the omission of Dan from the list must probably be regarded as arbitrary, Baucham says. Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that. Again, part 2 will spend more time on that. One tribe was frequently omitted in order to achieve a list of 12. That's true, because after Joseph, you have Ephraim and Manasseh, so the number goes from 12 to 13. So you gotta take one away to get this nice roundabout 12 number. So that's true, but it's still Dan, and Baucham knows all this. So he adds, the tradition that Antichrist was to come from the tribe of Dan, which is first found in Irenaeus, and then Hippolytus, again, these are early patristic writers, is unlikely. Baucham says this tradition is unlikely to be pre-Christian. In other words, he doesn't think it was part of the Jewish mindset, the Jewish cognitive environment at the time. Because or since the Antichrist figures of Jewish apocalyptic are invariably Gentile and pagan. In any case, he says, even this would scarcely account for the exclusion of the whole tribe from the eschatological Israel. So again, to summarize that, he notes the absence of Dan. That's his fourth anomaly. He thinks it's arbitrary. You got to take one out. So why not Dan? It's Dan's turn to be left out. Doesn't think there's anything to it. Again, because he's thinking that this whole idea is something that springs from Christian tradition, even though Christians use the Old Testament to get to this conclusion. He doesn't believe that it's present in Judaism, and so Baucham says, no, I don't think so. Again, we'll spend more time on the omission of Dan in part 2, but again, there's all four anomalies. Now, again, the point for now is that it does seem fair to me that the census lists and the tribal arrangement is, sort of on target. Maybe we don't have too much or an overemphasis on the military side. Maybe it really is about the portrayals and the restoration of the tribes. I think that's legitimate. That's on target. But I don't think that really means that the military element should just be dismissed or ignored. I think John is using that Old Testament theme as well to portray opposition on earth to the forces of evil, who it's going to turn out in the book of Revelation to be this Antichrist figure in the last days. Again, so I think spiritual warfare is much more in view than anything, again, boots on the ground kind of military engagement. So I think it should remain part of the picture and not just be, set aside. So for the rest of this episode, though, I want to drill down on a couple of other things. Now, one of the sources that I mentioned real early on, we have not used it too much, is Stephen Moyse. It's Moyise. He, in his book on the Old Testament, in the book of Revelation, raises two obvious questions about this chapter. He writes this: the two main questions that arise from John's use of this tradition concern the identity of those protected, the 144,000, and their relation to the great throng of Revelation 7:9. Like, is it the same group or a different group? Let me just go and read that. So after you get the list of the 144,000 in Revelation 7, that list ends with verse 8, and then verse 9 we read this. After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands. Then the description continues. But anyway, there are scholars who think that the great throng there is the 144,000, and others, and I'm including myself in this group, don't. I don't think they're from the tribes of Israel. I think that excludes them right away. I think you have two different groups here. But Moyse is saying the two questions are, who are these guys? Who are the 144,000? And what's the relationship to verse 9? And number two, second question, what is it that they are protected from? Okay, so let's take those two in order. So who are the 144,000, this identification? Moyse, again, will start us off again from his same source, his book on the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. He writes this: the sealing of the saints in Revelation 7, 2, and 3 is almost certainly modeled on Ezekiel 9, 4 through 6. So I'm going to read Ezekiel 9, 4 through 6, because he doesn't give you the full passage. He has an excerpt here, but let me just go there and read Ezekiel 9, because, again, I think this for sure is John's source material. I'm going to go back, and I'm going to start in verse 1, Ezekiel 9, and read through verse 6. Then he cried in my ears with a loud voice, saying, bring near the executioners of the city. Okay, if you remember way back in our series on Ezekiel, in chapter 8, you get this vision of the abominations of the temple, all the stuff that the people are doing wrong, and God is angry and so on and so forth. And so Ezekiel hears the voice of God. He cried in my ears with a loud voice, saying, bring near the executioners of the city, each with his destroying weapon in his hand. And behold, 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north, each with his weapon for slaughter in his hand. And with them was a man clothed in linen, and with a writing case at his waist. And they went in and stood beside the bronze altar. Now the glory of the God of Israel had gone up from the cherub on which it rested to the threshold of the house. And he called to the man clothed in linen who had the writing case in his waist. And the Lord said to him, pass through the city, through Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it. And to the others he said in my hearing, pass through the city after him, after the first guy, and strike. Your eyes shall not spare, you shall show no pity. Kill old men outright, young men and maidens, children and women, and touch no one on whom is the mark. And I begin at my sanctuary, with the priests. So they began with the elders who were before the house. That's first 6 verses. So you have this judgment scene in Ezekiel, again, basically for the thoroughgoing apostasy, not only of the priesthood and the temple, but the whole city. So Moïse says it's pretty hard to not see this as John's point of reference. So he writes, and he quotes this passage, go through the city, through Jerusalem, put a mark on the foreheads of those who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it. Right? Touch no one who has the mark. And then he compares that with Revelation 7, 2, and 3. I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun, having the seal of the living God, and he called with a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to damage earth and sea, saying, do not damage the earth or the sea or the trees until we have marked the servants of our God and with a seal on their foreheads. So Moïse says later tradition identified this sealing either with baptism, the laying on of hands, or the marking of the cross. This is later Christian tradition. And perhaps Paul's use of sphragidzane. It's a specific verb in 2 Corinthians 1:22. It means to certify or seal. So 2 Corinthians 1:22, Ephesians 1:13, Ephesians 4:30. And Moïse says Paul's use of sphragidzane in these passages made this later tradition inevitable. Nevertheless, he says, it seems clear that John's meaning is closer to Ezekiel's. Paul, let me just butt in here, Paul doesn't have sealing going on for some sort of purpose that would kind of align with the sealing of Ezekiel 9. Like that they're not being protected physically from something, okay, in Paul. So Moïse is saying John seems to be going the same direction as Ezekiel. He's not doing he's not tracking with Paul, he's tracking with Ezekiel. So he keeps writing and says, again, it seems clear that John's meaning is closer to Ezekiel's, namely that God's people are to be given a special mark to protect them from the approaching slaughter. One further point of interest is that the sealing episode is followed by an angel reaching into the altar and hurling fire onto the earth. Quote, then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth, Revelation 8:5, unquote. A similar thing follows Ezekiel's account of the sealing. Quote, this is 10:2. He said to the man clothed in linen, go within the wheelwork underneath the cherubim, fill your hands with burning coals from among the cherubim and scatter them over the city. Unquote. So Moïse is saying, look, even this element's there. So it would seem clear that the sealing is drawn from a Jewish text, Ezekiel 9, and wider Jewish context, the tribes and the census. Arguably the main factor in the identity of the 144,000, again, being the tribes, the restoration of the tribes. So On, again, is aware of all this, and he notes as much, but he sort of adds a little twist. So let me add his thought here. He says, many who think that Revelation 7:4-8 is based on a Jewish source hold that while the 144,000 may have originally referred to Jews or the real Israel, i.e. the ethnic Israel, that source has been reinterpreted by the author, John, to refer to a different group, such as the Christian church or Christian martyrs. There are others, however, who think that whether or not Revelation 7:4-8 is based on a Jewish source, the text in its present context refers to Jews. So right there you have a difference of opinion. And On lays it out. Even though this goes back to Ezekiel 9, he says, some scholars think John's reinterpreting it and applying it to Christians. And then there are others who would say, nope, these are all Jews. The 144,000 are Jews. They're not Gentile, in other words. See, and catch the way I said that. Because right away, even in the academic discussion, there's an odd mixing up or conflation of the term Christian and Jew. Okay, a Christian. You know, look, you can still be a Christian, you can still be a believer and be a Jew or a Gentile. But historically, again, in the history of interpretation, scholars have looked at this and saying, oh, ethnic Jews, that's one group. The other one says, nope, they're Christian church. Well, can't they still be Jews? I mean, if they're followers of Jesus, aren't they Christians anyway? But again, it seems like a lot of people don't even ask that question, which is kind of shocking, to be honest with you. But On is correct here. These are the two sides that historically have been taken. 144,000 are Jews. 144,000 are not Jews. So like it's this black and white either or thinking. And I'm going to end up objecting to this as we go on. So I think you can already tell that. But that's typically how this is laid out. So On goes into, okay, why does each side take its position? What are the arguments? Should we stick with the context of Ezekiel 9, Jews, or should we do something different with it? Okay, should we assume that John is altering it when he uses it, or is John being consistent again with his use of it? Where do we fall out here? So On writes this. He says there are several arguments that proponents of this view, as far as the Jewish view, put forward. A, the detailed enumeration of 12,000 sealed from each of the 12 tribes of Israel suggests that Jews or Jewish Christians are in view. See, now he throws that in. That's his safety net. Jews or Jewish Christians are in view. Okay, but they're still ethnic Jews. And I'm actually going to agree with that qualification. I think they are ethnic Jews, but I also think they're followers of the Lamb. They're believers. They're Christians. Okay, so let's try to keep the terminology straight here. So his first argument, again, for that view is, look, 12,000 from each tribe. Okay, that's what's in view. For while the 12 tribes in dispersion, James 1:1, for instance, can be used in a Christian context to represent the whole Christian church, inclusive of Gentiles, he says. A detailed enumeration of 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes does not lend itself easily to allegorization, which is, I don't know why he calls it that, but okay, we'll just let him go. B, his second argument, since the author is undoubtedly a Jewish Christian, it is not particularly surprising that he would have envisioned a special role in the eschaton for Christians of Jewish origin. That's easy enough. Paul struggled with the problem of the rejection of the gospel by most Jews in Romans 9-11, recognizing that not everyone descended from Israel belongs to the true Israel, Romans 9:6. Yet nevertheless, Paul held out the eschatological hope that Israel would eventually be converted, Romans 11:25-27. The eschatological tradition of the future gathering of Israel and the Gentiles at the New Jerusalem at the coming of Christ is found elsewhere in early Christian literature. See, now here he's getting confusing because now he's looping the Gentiles in. I don't know why he does this. What I want you as the listener to know, look, here are your options for the 144,000. All ethnic Jews having nothing to do with their status as Christians, which doesn't seem possible, okay? Because they're followers of the Lamb. The Lamb is Jesus. Second is they're all Christians with no Jewish ethnicity. Again, to me that's possible, but it doesn't seem right. To me, the better option is, okay, they're Jews, they're ethnic Jews, but they're Christians too. We don't have to have the Gentiles in the picture because, again, my view that you're going to hear in a moment is when you get to verse 9, the massive multitude from every tribe, every nation, those are the Gentiles. Okay, so, and these two groups, the 144,000 and the massive group in Revelation 7, they're on the same side. It's just two different ways of talking about the composition of the people of God. So to me, this doesn't seem like so much of a dilemma, but I want you to hear the academic discussion, because even the academic discussion is like, well, you say one thing, then you say another, then you mix the two, and it just gets really confusing, where I don't think it really has to be that confusing. So on keeps going on, and then he's going to talk about the other view. Okay, the one that sort of, I think, should we say, lands on this, oh, they're all Christians. Really, there's nothing to see here with, Jewish ethnicity. So opponents of the first view have proposed a number of arguments against interpreting the 144,000 as Jews or Jewish Christians. So this second view wants to see them as a mixed, as the church, mixture of Jew and Gentile, and no attention is being drawn. The second view says that the church is the new Israel anyway, so Jewish ethnicity is not even part of what's going on here. So those who defend that view say the 12 tribes did not literally exist in the first century AD. I mean, nobody knew their tribal affiliation. Okay? And the hope of their eventual restoration belonged not to the real, but to the ideal world. Against this objection, On's going to push back here because he doesn't buy this, and neither do I. So I'm going to let you have it here with him. Against this objection, it can be countered that Josephus, writing at the end of the first century, reckoned with the existence of 12 tribes in his day. So Josephus would have disagreed. Well, we do have people here who know what tribe they're from here in the first century. And Josephus, talked about the widespread eschatological hope of the regathering of the 12 tribes of Israel, which was certainly based on the assumption of their actual existence in the world. Why else would you hope for it? If there were no tribes at all, nobody knew what are you talking about tribes for? Well, then it wouldn't have been a big item of discussion in terms of the apocalyptic literature, the religious literature, but it was. Secondly, the distinction between Jewish Christianity and Gentile Christianity, common in the early decades of the Apostolic Age, was no longer current at the end of the first century. Again, I doubt that too, and so does On. He says, against this position, it may be argued that the debate between Christianity and Judaism continued well into the second century, as is evident in Barnabas and the dialogue of Justin Martyr. Third, so many of the ways of describing the real Israel have been applied to the church in Revelation that it would be perverse to treat Revelation 7, 4-8 as an exception to the rule. To this, it may be replied that while certain Old Testament language used of Israel is applied to Christians, okay, Christians are called, just generally, the church, believers generally are called a kingdom and a kingdom of priests, an allusion to Exodus 19:6. Again, this is found in Revelation 1:6, 5:10, so on and so forth. Sure, that happens. But Owen says the use of other traditional language in Revelation suggests that the church is constituted of both Jews and Gentiles, i.e. the 12 gates of the New Jerusalem bear the names of the 12 tribes, the sons of Israel, while the 12 foundations of the city bear the names of the 12 apostles. And so in other words, he's saying, look, they're on the same side, but there are passages that distinguish them too. So don't just, jam all of them together. So these are the two sides. Now, On is on the side that these 144,000 either are ethnic Jews or Jewish Christians, and my position is that they're Jewish Christians. Okay, this would seem coherent in light of the transition at Revelation 7:9. So On is going to argue for this, and again, I'm in agreement with him. He says there are striking differences between the two groups described in Revelation 7:4-8, 144,000, and Revelation 7:9-17, the rest of the chapter, that have to be borne in mind. Number one, there's a clear contrast between the specific enumeration of the 144,000 and the, quote, vast size of a great multitude, which, quote, no one was able to number. Well, it can't be the same because they just numbered them back in verses 4-8. So how does it make any sense to say that the massive group in verses 9-17 is the same as the 144,000? Well, it doesn't. The latter is obviously a much larger group than the former, and therefore very probably a different group. Second, On says, the 144,000 are composed of 12,000 drawn from each of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel, while the members of the great multitude, in explicit contrast, according to verse 9, are drawn from, quote, every nation and tribe and people and language group, unquote. Again, it's very obvious. Third, The 144,000 are apparently located on earth while the innumerable multitude is in heaven before the throne of God, Revelation 7:11. Again, that's pretty obvious too. Fourth, in Revelation 7:4-8, the 144,000 are in a situation of imminent peril that requires protective sealing, while the innumerable multitude of 7:9-17 has passed victoriously through the great tribulation and has received a heavenly reward. Obviously, they weren't sealed because they're dead. They've suffered, okay? So for my money, it makes more sense to have the 144,000 as Jews who are also Christians. They're loyal to the Lamb. They are Christians, but the Old Testament orientation suggests they should not be thought of as Gentiles. Gentiles are not included in this group. Again, they're not spiritual Israelites. They're Jews who follow the Lamb. Everything about Revelation 7:1-8 is Jewish and Old Testament in context. What does John repurpose? The census stuff, the tribes, and Ezekiel 9. I mean, everything is pointing in this direction. So again, in part 2, we're going to also throw in Levitical elements here as well when we get to, again, the whole issue of how does this possibly connect to the Watcher story. So I think Revelation 14 also is consistent with this. This is the other passage with 144,000, are mentioned. I don't see a contrast between that 144,000 and this 144,000. Again, some scholars argue the two groups are different, asserting that the 144,000 in Revelation 14 cannot be Jews, which makes zero sense in my mind. The only possible basis for such a conclusion is that the 144,000 in Revelation 14 are not listed by tribes. Okay, well, why would John need to do that twice? He's already done it once. Again, Revelation 7, why does he have to do it again? Again, this is John. He's not that neat. I mean, we've seen this countless times already. John just assumed, the same guy that assumes that you're going to be able to pluck out the 4 or 5 phrases from 4 or 5 different books of the Old Testament and know what he's doing with it and why, he probably expects you to remember something 7 chapters ago in the same document that he's writing. So to me, this is really a lame, sort of trajectory to try to distinguish one group from the other. The other thing that it says, well, the ones in chapter 14, they follow the Lamb. Well, so do these. I mean, lots of ethnic Jews followed the Lamb, followed Christ. Doesn't mean they aren't Jews. They don't lose their ethnicity. Again, this whole objection seems to confuse a spiritual label, Christian, follower of the Lamb, with an ethnic one, Jew. None of this, again, requires the notion that John intends to keep Jewish and Gentile believers separate, because elsewhere he's going to put everybody together in one people of God and so on and so forth. So my advice here, my little end times system jab of the day is pretty simple. Look, don't take the 144,000 and use their Jewish ethnicity to argue for a particular end time system that keeps the Jew, the Jewish believer, absolutely separate from the Gentile or the circumcision neutral thing we call the church, because John is going to join them elsewhere. Okay, and vice versa. Don't, for another end time system, take the merging passages and argue against the separation passages. This is typically what's done with end time systems. People pick the trajectory on which their system works best, and then they look back at the places where it doesn't work and they call them problem passages. Okay, let's just not do that. So Beale, again, gets into this a little bit. I'm not going to read everything that Beale has because, Beale, well, maybe I should, because Beale wants everything to be the church, right? He's Reformed, he wants everything to be the church. So I'll just read you what he has here. He says, some commentators understand the number 144,000 as literal and conclude that those who are sealed are a remnant of the ethnic Israelites. Again, why does it have to be that way, Dr. Beale? Why can't it be a group of Jewish Christians? But anyway, to be fair to him, this is how it is articulated, so that is fair. So the number of them conclude that must be a remnant of ethnic Israelites. This is a typical dispensational approach, for instance, which Beale is not. He says this is based on the presupposition that John's language is to be understood literally except where he states explicitly otherwise. It is also usually based on the futurist understanding of the book's structure. That's dispensationalism. According to which Revelation 4:1 all the way through 22:5 refers only to a future tribulation immediately preceding Christ's second coming. Accordingly, Revelation 7:4-8 is said to allude to a group of ethnic Israelites who come to believe in Christ during this tribulation period. So in other words, they're not even believers when they're sealed. They come to believe in a dispensational system, or at least some of them anyway. And then they'll get protected from martyrdom during it. It's unwise, again, to take the separation aspects, argue one end time system, and then ignore the places where they're merged. I'm sorry, but Old Testament imagery like the kingdom of priests. The Old Testament passages about ethnic Israel are applied to all believers in the book of Revelation, in the letters to the churches, where very clearly they're not just Jews there. Okay? That does happen in the book. So let's not just skip those to create our system and then call them problem passages or just ignore them. That's cheating. Okay, don't do that. This is why I say again, we'll add this to the very long list of how all systems of eschatology cheat somewhere. They just do. It's just that's just the way it is. So I'm going to skip a little bit here to what Beale says elsewhere. Again, Beale wants everything to be the church here. It should be obvious from this that the separation of Jews and Gentiles as believers must be married to assumptions about Revelation, describing a future tribulation period. So Beale notes, some commentators link Revelation 7:3-8 to the prophecy in Romans 11:24-26 that all ethnic, again, this is an assumption that he's shooting at, all ethnic Israel will be saved at Christ's second coming. Most holding this view attach figurative significance to the number 144,000. So isn't this wonderful? I mean, I'm glad I included this because look, do you realize what I just read there? Beale is, and again, I grew up in this tradition, and this actually does, you will actually read this, you actually encounter this, that there are going to be those who say, look, Revelation 7 is only Jews, and they're going to come to know the Lord or whatever during the tribulation, because the tribulation is against the Jew because the church has been raptured. Okay, and this is a fulfillment of Romans 11:24-26 that all Israel will be saved. So on the one hand, they're looking at it literally, that the 144,000 are literally ethnic Jews. But then when they go to Romans 11, they can't be literal there because it says all Israel. And here in Revelation 7, you got 144,000. So we don't like the subset because Romans 11 says all Israel. So the number of the passage we're taking literally must be figurative. Ta-da! So basically you get to argue your position from the same passage where part of it is literal and the other part's figurative. Just pardon my spasm. This is why I dislike eschatology so much, because I don't like cheating with outliers. I don't like cheating method. That's what this is. And, it's not just, that particular, end time system. You get it on the other side too, with assumptions about the church being the Israel as opposed to a new Israel, and the terminology matters. I mean, we've had podcast episodes on this before. The text does both, folks. It does both things, because the one people of God is composed of two units, we'll call them. You have ethnic Jews who follow Jesus, and you have Gentiles who follow Jesus. They are two different things, but collectively they are one. So let's just own that. And when they become one, their ethnicity isn't erased. The fact that the two become one doesn't mean that God has there isn't a single element, eschatologically speaking, of any of God's plans for national Israel. Again, how do we know that? There are certain passages that seem to suggest it. How about Armageddon? Again, it's a battle for Jerusalem. I would suggest that Jerusalem is in Israel. There are just things like this that seem ethnic Israel focused. There's a lot that isn't, because of the one new man idea, the one people of God. But there's still these outliers, and we need to let the outliers be outliers. We need to affirm both, rather than find some way to make them disappear and be grafted in. You see what I did there with Romans? They're grafted into our theological system, and it's just tactically, it's just not another Jewishism. It's not kosher. It just isn't. Anyway, but this is what you get with 144,000 discussions. So let's go down a little bit here. Beale wants, again, to have everything be the church. He says if Gentile believers are clearly identified together with the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel as part of the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21:12 and 14 and 24, and Revelation 22:2-5, then it is not odd that John should refer to them together with Jewish Christians in Revelation 7:4 as the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel. Well, okay, that's coherent in that you can see how he gets there, but it's not conclusive. Why can't we allow John to do both? Why does it have to be one or the other? There's one family of God. And it's a point of factuality that in the early church and New Testament theology, the one family derived from Jewish believers and Gentiles. There's no cosmic law that says that John can't talk about the one family in both ways. Okay, for example, Acts does it all the time, as do the epistles. Jewish believers and Gentile believers, okay? There's still one church. When Paul talks about Jews who follow Jesus, then he talks about his Gentile, friends. Did he just say that he doesn't believe that the church is one? No, of course not. It's ridiculous. Why can't John be talking both ways about the same single entity as well? The honest answer is there's no rule against it. The only thing against it is the effort to prop up a system. That's what's against it. Why not apply the already but not yet? Why not? Why not? If the Lamb in the book of Revelation is risen and ruling in some way but not enthroned until Revelation 21, we've seen this in a prior episode, why is it not reasonable to think that John delays the full picture of Gentiles being identified with the 12 tribes until Revelation 21 as well? Can't John do that? Can it be already but not yet? Again, my view is, yeah, it can. It can. So I don't find Beale's arguments persuasive here either. Second question, we got to keep moving here. Are the 144,000 specifically protected? Are they specially protected? Again, no surprise, you get more than one view of this too. So some samples are in order. Beale writes this: why God seals his servants is debated. The main alternatives are, number one, for protection from physical harm. Number two, for protection from demons. Number three, for protection from losing their faith and hence their salvation. Okay, so Beale says, basically he's saying I've encountered all three of these reasons here. Moyes, again, bring him back into discussion. He writes this of the same question about the special protection. As to the sealing of the 144,000, it does not appear to be protection against physical attacks. So he's out of the gate denying that it's protection against anything physical, given that they have already had to endure the effects of the first 6 seals, which is kind of an assumption. Neither is it likely to be protection against death, since Revelation consistently portrays martyrdom as the way to victory. Charles, that's R.H. Charles, who was the big New Testament and Enoch scholar of a century ago. Charles thinks it is protection against the satanic forces about to be unleashed. And he cites Revelation 9, the abyss passage, though one might have expected it to come directly before this instead of before the trumpets. So, Moyes is saying, the difference of opinion here. Owen, let's loop him in, sees things in a different way. He acknowledges, the other perspective. He says the seal of God explicitly provides special protection for the wrath of God that is coming upon the world. And he cites Revelation 9:4. There is no explicit indication that the sealed are not protected from the wrath of the ungodly, even though this is the claim of many commentators. In many early Christian texts, the eschatological tribulation was thought to be a present feature of Christian experience in the world, and no distinction was made between plagues and punishments sent by God upon humankind and the hostility and persecution inflicted on Christians by Jews. So there's your spectrum of opinion. Now, I think, for my money, I think Beale's note, he has a note about Ezekiel 9, and I think it's pretty decisive here, though with one qualification. So Beale writes this. Beale's the only one of these three that loops Ezekiel 9 into the protection question, oddly enough. He says Ezekiel 9 is often correctly proposed as the best background for the divine sealing, and I would agree. There God commands an angel to put a mark on all genuine believers, but instructs other angels to slay unfaithful Israelites. The mark on believers is to protect them from the coming wrath. which will be inflicted by the Babylonians and which unfaithful Israelites will suffer. Ezekiel 9, like Ezekiel 14, 20, or 12 through 23, apparently speaks of the physical protection of the righteous remnant within Israel, who have been purged from the unfaithful by the fire of judgment. This is confirmed by the same function of the mark of blood over the Hebrews' doors at Passover. So he loops Passover in here, Exodus 12, which may stand behind Ezekiel 9 itself. He's saying Passover might actually be behind Ezekiel 9, as well as behind Revelation 7, as is evident from the fact that the seal protects believers from the harmful effects of the following trumpet and bowl plagues, which have been modeled on the Exodus plagues. Let me just stop there. You see why I think this is decisive. It's like he's looping Passover in here because the next chapter is going to do that. As the trumpet and bowl, judgments get rolled out here in the book of Revelation, the 144,000 are going to be protected from them just as the faithful Israelites were at Passover. And it matters for this question that those judgments, the trumpet and bowl plagues, are modeled after the plagues of Exodus, the book of Exodus, leading up to the Passover, the death angel. So Beale's saying, look, you got to consider all this data. Back to him, he says, spiritual protection of the Israelite faithful may also be included in these two Old Testament texts. Whichever may be the case in Ezekiel or Exodus, uppermost in John's mind is certainly not physical security, but protection of the believer's faith and salvation from the various sufferings and persecutions that are inflicted on them, whether by Satan or by his demonic or earthly agents. Do you see what Beale just did there? He builds this physical argument about protection, modeled after the association with the plagues, and then he turns away from it, and now he makes it spiritual protection. I just want you to be as frustrated as I am. Okay. Because it's like, man, you're just right there. You're right there. You got Ezekiel 9, you got the Passover, you got the plagues, and Goshen and all this stuff. Okay, it's not perfect. It's not a perfect parallel or even a perfect argument, but there's obviously a physical element at least in here. And then he just turns around and goes the other direction. And ultimately Beale's going to argue that this is, protection from spiritual forces, and he's a Calvinist, so he doesn't, think that has a very low view of what he thinks is the concept of losing salvation here. So he's going to use this material against that. So it's really unsatisfying that he does such a nice job of providing some Old Testament context for a physical element and then just doesn't go there. It's just odd. If protection here means protection from, losing faith, then he has to see the 144,000 as the whole church, which is his view. Again, from a few minutes ago, he doesn't want to see them only as Jewish believers. He wants to see it as the whole church. And if you do that, then you're going to look at it this way, that we're protected from apostasy here, spiritual attacks and so on and so forth. But the very data that he uses could be used to go the other way. So I just, again, it's a little unsatisfying as to what is done with this material. I think to sum up here, I think the best way to look at the 144,000 is, again, these are ethnic Jews. I think John's description is deliberate. I think he's using the census, the tribes, Ezekiel 9, again, as a parallel to them. He loops, the biggest argument for me is Revelation 7:9, because it's very clear that the group that is in verses 9 through the end of the chapter is different than the one in the first 8 verses. First 8 verses, very clear Old Testament, i.e. Israelite Jewish elements there to portray this group. And after that point, verse 9 and onwards, you don't have any of that. Every tribe, every people, every language, every nation, and it can't be numbered. So how can it be that, how can it be what you see in the first 8 verses? Doesn't make any sense to me. So if you have this distinction, to me that opens the door to not only Ezekiel 9 being about some sort of physical protection there, but also I think Beale's observations about Passover are legit. Now, if you think about the Exodus plagues, okay, let's just not all of them, sort of totally exempted the Israelites. After all, the last one, death of the firstborn, they had to go into their house, they had to put the blood on the lintel. I mean, otherwise they would have died. So there's no necessary immunity there. You gotta do what the Lord tells you to do to avoid physical harm. You have to take that mark, okay, on the house, house door, doorposts, and lintel. So there's that element of the plague of darkness. I mean, when we went through Exodus, I pointed out that in some of these, it's very clear that Israel didn't suffer whatever the plague was. But in other cases, that's not said, or it would be almost impossible to see how it could be like the plague of darkness. It's dark, okay? I mean, there's no like spotlight shining on Goshen. I mean, you never see that. So even with those qualifications, though, there's clearly at least an element of physical protection in the plague accounts that I do think, because as we keep going through Revelation, what happens to people, and the 144,000 are now part of this group, what happens to them is modeled after the plagues. And some of those, the believers did not suffer them. So I think you've got to just honor that rather than just saying, oh, it's all about, losing your faith or something like that. No. Why? Again, why marshal the argument and eliminate that possibility? For sure, it's spiritual warfare. Okay, that's going to be obvious. Any threat to have somebody, surrender the faith, or become, go drift off into unbelief. Of course, that's a spiritual, warfare issue. Of course, and you're going to get demonic forces that are described in the book of Revelation. Of course, but why is it that we sort of run from some of these other elements? I don't think it's very consistent. I think the other reason why Beale does it is because, again, he wants to move as far away as he can from, let's be honest, cartoonish interpretations of the book of Revelation. I get that, but that really isn't an excuse to deny the parallels that you've just helped us see. Why would you do that? I mean, give me a good reason. Here's this reason I understand. You don't want to, again, go to fantasy land here. But on the other hand, they're still there. The parallels are still there. So why must we cancel that out? Why can't we just hold that up and say, look, this could be an element right here? Now, again, if you're looking at the book of Revelation as something already fulfilled, or at least 99% fulfilled in the first century, i.e. with the temple destruction 70 AD, well then you can't. You really can't do anything with the parallels to the Exodus plagues. Where would the evidence be that Jews who followed Jesus were protected when the Romans came into town and destroyed the temple? I mean, I don't know where you're going to argue that. So that that sort of takes that away from you. But for anyone who's not in that position, a non-preterist view, and who wouldn't be sort of seeing any of this, or who's willing to see at least some of this be like a boots on the ground, reality. Maybe not Hal Lindsey or something like that, okay? But if you're at least willing to see, again, real-time stuff in what's in the content of the book of Revelation preceding the second coming and all that, it would seem to me that this still has to be on the table. This possibility at least. Let's just call it a possibility at least, that our examination of the Old Testament and its connections into Revelation renders this a possibility as far as how to look at things. So I think we need to let it there, just leave it there, and not try to argue it away or cancel it out, because I think the text opens that door and leaves it open. I don't think there's any way to successfully exegetically cancel it out. So that's all I'm trying to say. So next time we're going to get into part 2, and we'll hit the elements of Revelation 7 that get into the whole issue of how this might relate to the Book of the Watchers. And if you've read Reversing Hermon, you're going to know some of the source material I'll take us back into there. The Dan and the Antichrist thing, we'll get into that a little bit more. So that'll be what we cover in part 2, and we should be able to wrap up Revelation 7 in that second part. Well, okay, we'll just do it the simple way. We are back in Revelation 7. This is part 2. And we are talking about the 144,000. This time, we sort of just went through the passage last time, talked about different features of it, the number and whatnot, and, just sort of different lines and things that pop up as you read through, especially, the tribal arrangement, the Old Testament connections back to this sort of thing, the number, the census thing, and the tribes and whatnot. Whether they're protected or not, we sort of telegraphed that when we get to the point about, the plagues being unleashed, that there's an allusion here in this chapter to that, and then that, of course, factors into issue with the plagues of Egypt and were the Israelites protected, and if they were, the 144,000 protected. So we did some of that in part 1. And we reserved part 2 sort of for, different topical approaches to this. And what we talked about last time was I alluded to the fact that when we get to part 2, we're going to talk about a possible connection with the Book of the Watchers. That's, first 36 chapters of the Book of Enoch, and also the Antichrist from Dan tradition. And by the end of going through those two things, we actually will sort of also pick up a little bit of, related to how this chapter is used or maybe shouldn't be used or something like that in regard to certain points of end times schemes or scenarios that people will be familiar with today. So I want to get into the Book of Watchers connection first. We're just going to take, that and then the Antichrist from Dan idea and then sort of mop up chapter 7 in this episode. And if you've read Reversing Hermon, my book, there's going to be some of this content in that book, but we're going to say a few more things about this issue, this possible connection, give you a little more detail here than I do in the book. And we'll do the same thing with the Antichrist from Dan tradition. And when I get to the Antichrist from Dan tradition, I'm going to have to be a little bit careful because, believe it or not, this is a trajectory in my third novel. So I got to be a little cagey with that, but we'll step around that when we get to it here. So Book of the Watchers connection, Revelation 7, 1 through 8, of course, is the 144,000. And then there's another passage in which the 144,000 are mentioned. And this is the passage where there might be, again, some scholars argue for a possible connection back to the Book of the Watchers idea, or at least, more broadly, the events of Genesis 6. Okay. So in Revelation 14, 1 through 5, that's the second passage, we read this. I'm going to read the first 5 verses. Again, this is ESV. Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the roar of many waters, like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps. And they were singing a new song before the throne, and before the 4 living creatures and before the elders. No one could learn that song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. It is these who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These have been redeemed from mankind as firstfruits for God and the Lamb. And in their mouth no lie was found, for they are blameless. So that's Revelation 14, 1 through 5. You see already, in the very first verse there, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, with him 144,000 who had his name, the Lamb's name, and his father's name written on their foreheads. So there we have the bearing the name concept, which should be familiar to this audience, through, Carmen Imes' work, and we've had her on the podcast, and we've talked about this before, that how this relates to imaging God, and these two concepts go together. Carmen's focus, of course, is Old Testament material, but, she drifts into the New Testament as well in her book, Bearing the Name. And this is representation. And in this, one of the specific Old Testament contexts is the high priest. So right away for a Jew listening to this, they're going to associate this language with broadly Israelites bearing the name of Yahweh, and specifically the high priest who like literally bore the name on his forehead. Okay. And that priestly context is going to be, part of, the part of the approach when it comes to this whole thing. Is there a connection to the Book of the Watchers? The key verse, though, is going to be verse 4. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. Now, let's just back up a little bit and think about the 144,000 as they are cast in this passage. They're in the heavenly Zion, okay, God's throne room. This is a divine council scene, all right. Verse 3, we have another reference to the throne and the cherubim, and, we go back, to Revelation 7 that follows on the heels of Revelation 4 and 5, pretty closely, and there hooks back into Revelation 4 and 5, the divine council scene. So we're in the heavenly Zion, God's throne room. We've got the cherubim here, the throne. It's the spiritual realm. Now, this is one reason why the 144,000 of chapter 7 are viewed as a different group. Okay, remember we talked about this in part 1. But why cannot John have have an earthly 144,000 who are then in the vision? Remember, this is a vision. Also before the throne of God. Perhaps this is some sort of commissioning scene. We talked about, is Revelation 7 or Revelation 4 and 5, I should say, is the Lamb, is this a commissioning scene? Is it some other kind of way to look at this enthronement? Or, we went through all these different categories. And in the course of doing that, and then the course of the 144,000 in part 1, there was this division about whether Revelation 7 or Revelation 14 are two different groups. The majority of scholarship doesn't hold them as two different groups because this is a vision. There's no necessary reason why the 144,000, earthly can't also be present in heaven and so on and so forth, because this is a visionary context. We're at we've seen these guys before. Is this, some sort of flashback, to their commissioning? I mean, who knows? There's any number of ways to argue that they don't have to be distinguished. We're going to set that aside and focus on verses 4 and 5 here, because we've already sort of covered, this other topic. Verses 4 and 5 mark them as virgins, specifically male virgins who have, quote, not defiled themselves with women. And then thirdly, they're playing on their harps, they're singing a new song before the throne. So this is this heavenly scene. And then we've got this sort of weird, almost feels like a throwaway line. Like what is the fact that they haven't defiled themselves with women? What does that have to do with a divine council, a throne room scene, a heavenly, scene in the divine abode and worship? And, what does that have to do with anything? It just seems like it sticks out like a sore thumb. Now, again, that's one of the obvious questions. There are others that go along with this, because again, the passage starts out with this bearing the name concept, which again, a Jew would associate with Israelites bearing the name. And let's not forget, Israelites were supposed to be, quote unquote, a kingdom of priests. And we've got the high priest who literally bears the name on his forehead. So here's a question we could bring to it. Are the 144,000 here portrayed as a heavenly priesthood? Now, we've actually talked about this before in relationship to the elders and that whole discussion of Revelation 4 and 5. We talked a little bit about how certain sects of Judaism had this notion of that they were on earth the mirror image or the symbiotic, group that corresponded to the heavenly, the angelic priesthood. Okay, this is known from Qumran, the Shabbat Shirot, and so on and so forth. So this is a legitimate question. Are they portrayed as a heavenly priesthood? And again, one of the reasons you'd ask this question is the bearing the name concept, and also this, male virgin thing. Okay, so let's just proceed a little bit. We asked why this specific note, because Israelite priests could be married. I mean, there wasn't a rule against that. You go back in the Old Testament, you can see that very plainly. Now, last week we talked about how a few scholars, Ahn and Bauckham, suggested that the sexual abstinence here was part of a military motif. Practicing abstinence, sexual abstinence before going to war, and you'll find that in the Hebrew Bible. But if you think about that analogy, well, the warriors there, they weren't virgins. Okay, they might have abstained before going to battle, but they're not virgins. I mean, they're just not. Okay, so that doesn't seem to really work well. I mean, and, you could still argue a military context, at least, part of the context, on the basis of tribal arrangement, census, demonic opposition. I mean, you don't need this sexual abstinence motif to have the military flavoring of Revelation 7, the 144,000, be there. You have these other things that you can build the same argument out of. The abstinence idea is pretty weak, actually. And again, the virgin idea, specifically for some scholars, takes them in quite a different direction. Now, there are two scholarly studies on this passage that have argued that this description presents the 144,000 as priestly figures. Again, they're in the presence of God. They occupy sacred space. They're worshiping at the throne. They bear the name, okay? That they're priestly figures who are intended as an oppositional reverse analogy to the sexual defilement of God's other holy ones, who at one point occupied sacred space in heaven, but who did defile themselves by sexual engagement with women. And that would be the fallen sons of God of Genesis 6:1-4, or the Watchers, as they are known in Second Temple Jewish literature. Those two articles are D.C. Olson, and the title is Those Who Have Not Defiled Themselves with Women, subtitle, Revelation 14:4 and the Book of Enoch. That's from Catholic Biblical Quarterly, Volume 59, Number 3, 1997, pages 492 to 510. And then the second one is Terrell Manikam, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, and Jan A. Durand. The title here is The 144,000 Undefiled Levites. So it actually has it in the title, this priestly idea. The 144,000 undefiled Levites of Revelation 14:1-5, and the link to the defiled watchers of 1 Enoch 1-36. That's the title, long title. And the publication, the journal, is pretty obscure. In fact, this might be in my library of 7,000 or 8,000 journal articles that pertain to this sort of stuff. This might be the only article from this source. The Ecclesiasticos Pharos Journal, Volume 94, Number 1, 2012, pages 123 to 136. Now, I put both of these in the protected folder for anybody who's interested in them. In Reversing Hermon, I really focus on Manikam and Durand's article. They reference Olson because Olson's was written, 1997. Theirs is 2012. So they interact with it. So I don't really bother in the book anyway, getting into the first one. But we're going to say a few things, here, drawn a little bit more from from Olson, so that you get the flavor for what he's arguing. But I'm still going to use, Manikam and Durand to do that. Again, you can access both of these articles in the protected folder if you want to. So they take note, Manikam and Durand take note of Olson's work, obviously, as I just noted, and they write this. This is one point where they sort of summarize some things. Olson argues that the redeemed 144,000 virgins, Revelation 14:4a, stand in radical opposition to the defiled fallen angels mentioned in 1 Enoch 1-36, who were engaged in sexual practices with the daughters of men, Genesis 6:1-4. According to Olson, the 144,000 virgins of Revelation 14 are an anti-image to not only the followers of the beast mentioned in the preceding chapter and Revelation 14 again, 6-20, and of course we get the beast in Revelation 17 and 18, but also to the fallen angels of 1 Enoch 1-36. He also argues that by contrasting the redeemed with the watchers, John is actually giving the 144,000 the role of good angels, unquote. Again, that's very interesting, especially since we've already talked a little bit about angelic priesthood, both, in some earlier episodes. If you've read Unseen Realm, you should be familiar with this idea. We did an episode on Hebrews 12, the cloud of witnesses. I mean, we've been on this topic before, this notion of angelic priesthood or believers, joining the council and so on and so forth. So this is actually part of that mix. Olson, this is one of the angles that he pursues. Now, Manikam and Durand try to develop Olson's observation by more observations of the Watcher's tradition, and they expand the idea to argue that the 144,000 represent the entire people of God in the manner of the Old Testament idea of substitution. What they mean by that is that the whole firstborn thing, the Levites take the place of the firstborn offering of everything else. This is Numbers 3, 40, and 41. Okay, so that, God is owed the firstborn, and the tribe of Levi sort of has this function in the Old Testament. So he's drawing on that as well. And this is actually alluded to in Revelation 14. These have been redeemed from mankind as first fruits for God and the Lamb. Okay, so this notion of substitution, a la, again, the firstborn, is actually mentioned in the passage. So Manikam and Durand are going to pursue that idea and a few other things from the Book of the Watchers to sort of build out Olson's argument. Now, for our purposes, really only the Watchers tradition is of interest, and we have to limit this somehow for this episode so we can get through Revelation 7. The other aspect, the firstborn, we're not going to do so much with that. But, I think Olson, this is a meaningful trajectory. I don't think his idea should be dismissed. I think this is, part of it. But in general, how do Manikam and Durand, with Olson, because they're on the same side too, How do they make these points? The idea that the 144,000 are a mirror opposition to the fallen watchers. So I'm going to just walk you through their arguments here. So what they do first is they go through some passages where Levites and angels do similar things, just general ministries. They look at different vocabulary for what angels do and then what Levites do and note, hey, the same Hebrew lemma is used here. Okay, that sort of thing. So they write this. The Levites were, to a certain degree, God's holy ministering servants on earth as compared to angels being God's heavenly servants. Let me just stop there. If you're already thinking of, again, this notion of how believers are going to be grafted into the council, and essentially replace what has been lost through rebellion in heaven. Again, this is all part of that matrix of ideas. So what they're suggesting here should be familiar to people in this audience who have, are familiar with the content of Unseen Realm and have been listening to the podcast for a while. So this is their beginning point, this simple observation. The Levites were to a certain degree God's holy ministering servants on earth as compared to angels being God's heavenly servants. Okay, this is also the concept of imaging. Why there's plurals in Genesis 1. Again, this is all Unseen Realm content, how the plurality language in that passage somehow links God with humans, with the heavenly host to whom God is speaking. And again, it's not the Trinity. I'm not going to rehearse all that material here, but it basically sets up this relationship between us. We are God's imagers here in this in the earthly sphere He has created for human habitation, and they are God's imagers in the spiritual world. Again, simple idea, very straightforward. So they reference here Hebrews 1:14, Numbers 3:5-9, Numbers 8:11, Deuteronomy 18:5. Okay. They give a number of examples, but here's one. For example, both the angels and Levites were engaged in the worship of God. That's a pretty easy, straightforward example. Hebrews 1:6, Revelation 4:5, Deuteronomy 18:5. Now, they move away from this pretty quickly. So as an editorial note here, just on my own, I actually think this part of their argument is weak and could be a lot stronger. And I think it needs to be because it's fairly central to where they're going to go. So I would suggest they need to strengthen this by working through the Second Temple material related to the idea of humans as the angelic priesthood. Again, Qumran is the example that the Qumran community clearly saw themselves this way. And in the absence of a literal temple, they mime temple service out there in the desert. They're effectively casting themselves as the quote-unquote real Levites. Okay, we're the real priests here that kept heaven and earth in sync. Again, all you got to do is read anything on Qumran calendar, the whole disagreement, over that issue, why they separate from the Jerusalem priesthood. I mean, there's a lot more they could do with this, but they don't. So it's kind of disappointing, but it's still a legitimate point. If you want a quick article on that, again, I've referenced this before in earlier episodes, Devorah Demont, Men as Angels, the Self-Image of the Qumran Community. And that's from the book Religion and Politics in the Ancient Near East, Studies in Jewish History and Culture. It's a 1996 book, so she has a chapter in that. It's quite good. Secondly, here's the second trajectory they follow. So the first thing they say is, hey, there's this service relationship. Second, the watchers forsook their heavenly standing by defiling themselves with earthly women. In other words, they transgressed both the boundary between them and humanity, and in so doing, they despised the identity given to them by God. They thus no longer represent the holy ones of heaven. The opposite of this, in this argument, is the virginity. They have, quote unquote, not defiled themselves with women, unquote. The opposite of this is the virginity of the 144,000 and their election to represent believers, or if one prefers, Jewish believers. That goes back to part one, that whole argument. Number 3, the Levitical instructions about who priests should marry, that's Leviticus 21, contains language similar to that of Revelation 14 in regard to the 144,000. So yes, priests could marry. They're not, virgins, but nevertheless, we get instructions about who priests should marry and who they shouldn't. This is Leviticus 21, 14, and 15. A widow or a divorced woman or a woman who has been defiled or a prostitute, these he, the priest, shall not marry. But he shall take as his wife a virgin of his own people, that he may not profane his offspring among his people. Okay, that's one of the Levitical rules. for who priests should marry. So they're correct here. There's some of this language is picked up on, or at least there's an echo here in Revelation 14. Now, this description, again, this not defile themselves among women or with women. This description, it is argued by Monicam and Durand and Olson, is how first Enoch views what the watchers did. And here's what they think is a direct connection. So I'm going to read 1 Enoch 15, 1 through 9. So this is how the writer of 1 Enoch views what the watchers did. And you're going to see that there are thematically, and in terms of, if we compared the lemmas here with LXX of Leviticus and Revelation, you're going to get some hits. You're going to get some matches here. But just conceptually, here's how the writer of 1 Enoch viewed the offense. 1 Enoch 15, verse 1. And he answered and said to me, and I heard his voice, Fear not, Enoch, thou righteous man and scribe of righteousness, approach hither and hear my voice. And go, say to the watchers of heaven, who have sent thee to intercede for them. Remember, the watchers try to get Enoch to be a negotiator with God. Let us get out of the chains and the abyss and all that stuff, okay? So go, say to the watchers of heaven who have sent thee to intercede for them, you should intercede for men, and not men for you. Wherefore have ye left the high, holy, and eternal heaven, and lain with women, and defiled yourselves with the daughters of men, and taken to yourselves wives, and done like the children of earth, and begotten giants as your sons. And though you were holy, spiritual, living the eternal life, you have defiled yourselves with the blood of women, and have begotten children with the blood of flesh. And as the children of men have lusted after flesh and blood, as those also do who die and perish. In other words, you're behaving like mortals. Verse 5, Therefore have I given them wives also, that they might impregnate them and beget children by them, that thus nothing might be wanting to them on the earth. God says, this is why I let humans do this, because they need to perpetuate the species, all right? Verse 6, But you were formerly spiritual, living the eternal life, and immortal for all generations of the world, and therefore I have not appointed wives for you, for as the spiritual ones of the heaven, in heaven is their dwelling. And now the giants who are produced from the spirits of flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they were born from men, and from the holy watchers is their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on the earth, and evil spirits shall they be called. That's the end of the passage. It's very clear, origin of evil spirits, demons from this event. This is one of the more explicit passages. So consequently, the argument is, when you hit Revelation 14:4, and you read, It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins, that language is meant to be a mirror opposite of what the watchers did. So the 144,000 are the other side of the watcher's coin. Fourth trajectory that is used here. Since the 144,000 are seen in Revelation 14 in the heavenly temple, and they are opposite the watchers in terms of purity and faithfulness, they also symbolically replace the watchers. Hence, Monicam and Durand's summary of Olson, quote, John is actually giving the 144,000 the role of the good angels, unquote. This, of course, also dovetails with the broader idea that believers replace the fallen council members, which is, that's wider than Genesis 6, but obviously this would play a big part of that. Now, as I noted in Reversing Hermon, that book, quote, the theological point is that the 144,000 holy ones who fight the beast, the Antichrist, are counterparts to the holy ones who rebelled and defiled themselves with women. John telegraphs that these holy ones will help their earthly compatriots defeat the beast and rectify the impurity brought to earth by the watchers. Again, I think there is something to this approach, but I'd like to see more thorough research done in defense of it. In other words, I like the content of Olson and Monicam and Durand's articles, but there are parts of the argument that need development, and I think could get further development. So this is sort of a dissertation topic, really. I'd like to see more thorough research into Revelation 7 and 14 with the Septuagint vocabulary, for instance, about the priests, aligning that plus or minus, with the Greek Enoch vocabulary, And then I'd like to see a thorough investigation of angelic priesthood texts. They're just things that they could do, I think, to make, to add support, to bolster this argument, this trajectory. But right now, where I sit, looking at the work that exists on this point, I think there's something to it. I do think there's something to it. It let's put it this way. This has pretty good explanatory power. It's better than, this is like warriors in Israel who didn't have sex before going out to battle. That's actually quite weak. This is better. Doesn't mean it's the right, answer. So it's just better. It has more explanatory power, and I'd like to just see more done with it. Let's go on to number 2, Antichrist and Dan. And again, this is quite debatable. In Reversing Hermann, I'm just going to read you some parts of Reversing Hermann so we get into the subject. I take a sort of a less positive view of this in that book. And again, I have to be cagey here because I'm actually going to use this idea in its association with some other things in the third novel. But anyway, from Reversing Hermann, I wrote this. Dan had a checkered history. The tribe forsook its allotted inheritance in the south of Canaan and migrated north, appropriating the priest of Micah the Levite, who kept household gods and an idol in his house. That's Joshua 19:40-48 and Judges 18. The Danites eventually conquered the city of Laish and renamed it Dan, Judges 18:27-29, and this city became a cult center to Baal in later Israelite history. Earlier in Israel's history, instead of receiving a blessing from the dying Jacob like his brothers, the patriarch pronounced instead, quote, Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path that bites the horse's heels so that his rider falls backwards, unquote. Thanks for the blessing, Dad. That's not really a blessing. It's Genesis 49:17. To continue with what I wrote, Deuteronomy 33:22 contains the cryptic note that, quote, Dan is a lion's cub that leaps from Bashan, unquote. And there's Bashan again, the creepy place. Now, these failures and passages associate Dan with rebellion against God, the region of Bashan, whose name in Canaanite would have been Bathan, serpent, and Baal worship at a location at the foot of Mount Hermon. Okay, so there's a lot going on there, all right? Back to what I wrote here. It is no wonder that some early church writers believed that the reason Dan was omitted from Revelation 7 was because the Antichrist, in other words, the enemy of the 144,000, would come from the tribe of Dan. That's a belief you'll find in early church writings. And then I quote C.E. Hill, who has a journal article that's a study of this idea, this tradition. He writes this, our first explicit mention of a Jewish Antichrist comes in the writings of Irenaeus, where it occurs already in tandem with the opinion that he will also spring from the tribe of Dan. This is his Against Heresies 5.30.2. Somewhat surprisingly, Irenaeus brings forth but 2 scriptural passages in support of Antichrist's Danite origin. The first is Jeremiah 8:16 in the Septuagint, which in English translation is, we shall hear the voice of his swift horses from Dan. The whole earth shall be moved by the voice of the neighing of his galloping horses. He shall also come and devour the earth, and the fullness thereof, the city also, and they that dwell therein, unquote. Continuing with Hill, he, Irenaeus, finds further support for this in the omission of Dan from the list of the 12 tribes of the sealed in Revelation 7:5-7. Little ellipsis here. Antichrist from the tribe of Dan makes his first known appearance in Irenaeus, but it is in Hippolytus that he finds his most scrupulous and eloquent biographer. Hippolytus's copious description proceeds on the principle that, quote, the deceiver seeks to liken himself in all things to the Son of God, unquote. As Jesus was the lion from the tribe of Judah, referring to Jacob's blessing on Judah in Genesis 49:17, Antichrist will be the lion from the tribe of Dan, referring to Moses' blessing, or his words at least, on the tribe of Dan in Deuteronomy 33:22. So that's the end of the Hill quotation. Now, the difficulty with these ideas is that the Antichrist figure elsewhere, is pretty clearly Gentile. Isn't that interesting? And here, again, I have to be a little cagey. All I'm going to say, in Reversing Hermann, I brought up this point. So look, the Antichrist elsewhere is a Gentile. And of course, evangelicals assume that Antichrist means some sort of fake counterfeit Jesus, and so they opt for a Jew. But the Antichrist idea of the New Testament generates from, again, two Old Testament sources or ideas. The first is the Messiah must surely have a final day of the Lord enemy. In other words, that's not a counterfeit Messiah, but an enemy, an oppositional figure. Okay, like a supernaturally empowered warrior or a divine warrior that aligns himself against the divine warrior that is the Messiah. And therefore, it would make sense for a Gentile to be opposed to a Jewish Messiah. So that's one trajectory in the Old Testament. The second is that Daniel 9 and 11 get repurposed in the New Testament. If Daniel is accurate in historical terms in these chapters, the eschatological enemy of the people of God in that material was Antiochus IV, who was a Gentile. Okay, so this is what casts the Antichrist firmly in New Testament scholarship as a Gentile. Now let's go back here. We've got all that. And again, we sort of operate with this assumption. Again, the difficulty of these ideas, the Antichrist figures elsewhere is pretty clearly a Gentile. Okay, here's the question. And I'm not going to get into it here because this would be a whole episode, maybe 2 episodes. And again, it's a trajectory for my 3rd novel. What if Dan was not an Israelite tribe? That would make Dan Gentile, wouldn't it? There's a historical problem with Dan and the Danite migration in Joshua and the book of Judges. And it goes like this. Again, this is very short form. And there are ways that you could acknowledge what I'm going to say here and still have Dan be an Israelite tribe. It would be and not be. In other words, there's one of the explanations for what I'm going to share with you here is that the original Jewish tribe of Dan in the south was either conquered or willingly assimilated people known as the Denyen or the Danunai or the Dan. There's like 3 or 4 different spellings of this here. So the Denyen, the Danu Naoi, the Danu, Danunen. I mean, again, there's a bunch of different spellings. It's a sea people tribe. It's a Gentile tribe from specifically the Aegean and even more specifically Mycenae. Now, if you've read my 2nd novel, Mycenae should just make, the hair on the back of your neck stand up, okay? So there's this whole issue of, Dan. Why is Dan referenced later in the prophets? Dan, why did he stay in the ships, at a certain, battle? Why didn't he fight against certain peoples in the promised land that were also sea peoples? Well, maybe it's because Dan was essentially a sea people tribe, or maybe it's because Dan was a seafaring tribe because that's what the sea people, you see all these things. This is again, one of these little subset issues in Old Testament scholarship. It doesn't mean that there weren't 12 original tribes, including an original Jewish Dan tribe. But what it does mean is that Dan has problems, okay? Dan could very well be conceived of as a group of sea peoples predominantly that usurp this tribe's position, migrate north, and do Gentile stuff, and basically become a problem, historically, theologically, religiously. And if that's the case, a Jew wouldn't have sort of been startled if you would have suggested that the Antichrist might come from Dan, and it works with Gentile typologies. That's a possibility. That's all I'm going to say here. Okay. So the Danite problem, the Danite migration problem, is an issue that might contribute to a Dan Antichrist typology. Now, I don't discuss this in Reversing Hermann. Again, that would have been like adding 100 pages to the book, and I couldn't do that at that point. But you're going to see this again, okay? Again, if you read my fiction, that's where I get to play with it a little bit. But I'm telling you here because we should not dismiss the Danite Antichrist thing. And let's just say it more broadly. The great eschatological enemy thing, okay? The opponent of the eschatological Messiah and his people being a Gentile, Dan might be part of that picture. It might be part of that typology. We should not exclude that or dismiss it if we're committed to this great eschatological enemy being a Gentile. I think that's fairly obvious, okay? that he's not a Jew, but that doesn't exclude the Dan thing. Okay, enough said there. So, it's difficult to really say too much more about that, but that is the Dan Antichrist trajectory. And one of the prongs of it, one of the things that propels it, is probably a better way to say it, is the omission of Dan in, the 144,000 list. Now, you might recall from the first episode of part 1 here, that's not the only omission. Who else is omitted? Okay, usually, think of the 12, the original 12. Okay, Dan included, and Joseph. Okay, those are the 12 sons of Israel. Usually, when Joseph is not included, in the tribal, lists, what do you get? We get his 2 boys, his 2 sons, half tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh. Okay, guess which other than Joseph, he doesn't show up in a lot of tribal lists anyway. But his usual stand-ins, Ephraim and Manasseh, also do, there's an issue there. Guess which one of those is not in Revelation 7's list? Ephraim. Okay, why would that be significant? Well, because Ephraim was the capital of the apostate northern kingdom. Okay, and Ephraim, in Ephraim's territory, the whole of it, Bashan is included in Dan to Beersheba. Dan is in the north, okay? So Ephraim's not there either. So again, this is one of those things where there could be something to this, and we shouldn't dismiss it because of the Gentile part of the typology. So to me, it really hinges on whether there's a Danite problem and how the Danite problem worked, which is probably an unanswerable question. What exactly happened here? But if something happened to make the other tribes suspicious of Dan, and that something at least included something of a Gentile composition in their people, okay, in the tribe, the tribe gets polluted. We'll just say it, with Gentiles. Okay, there's this. If that's the case, then that's on the table. It's on the table, when it comes to this other material. So let's move on. Again, there's a lot you can run around and do research on the Danite problem. Like I said, it's complicated, lots of facets to it, a number of different ways to address it. But that's a subject for 1 or 2 other episodes, and I don't know that we'll ever do that. But again, you will see it in the novel, number 3. Third, let's just move on and mop up the chapter here. Revelation 7, 13, and 14. There's one other thing I want to get into here, and that is the phrase Great Tribulation. Okay, so let's go to Revelation 7, 13. Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, "Who are these clothed in white robes, and from where have they come?" And I said to him, "Sir, you know." And he said to me, "These are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb." Okay, that's Revelation 7, 13, and 14. Now, I want to just say a few things about this phrase, because as soon as you say great tribulation, that phrase is going to be interpreted. It's going to be parsed in certain ways by certain end times systems. Okay. We've already talked about the Old Testament. We already talked, I should say, about the Old Testament context for the white robe imagery. Again, that in the verses I just read. We're not going to go back and rehearse all that, but I want to focus on this phrase. That's all we're going to do the rest of the episode. It does have an Old Testament context, and it's not what many in the audience might presume. The usual idea is Great Tribulation equals the 70th week of Daniel. But the concept of a 7-year tribulation never appears in Daniel 9, 24 through 27. Okay, when you get the 70th week talk. The closest you come is Daniel 9, 25 in that mix. Let me just read this to you. Daniel 9, 25. "Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time." So the troubled time is again a possible reference vocabulary associated with a tribulation period. But if you'll notice, this stuff happens. It'll be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. This stuff would happen somewhere during the first 69 weeks. It's not the 70th week. Okay, the anointed one rises, and you have this building going on in a troubled time, and then it's only later that the anointed one gets cut off, and so on and so forth. So it's not a match. A lot of people think it is, but it's not if you actually look closely at what it's saying. So that's one problem. The other problem is the vocabulary for tribulation never occurs with the terminology for week or 7 in either the Old Testament or the New Testament. So the assumption that the Great Tribulation is the 70th week of Daniel or the last 7 of Daniel, there's actually no textual support for that. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be. It means there's no textual support for it. There is, though, a better Old Testament context for the quote-unquote Great Tribulation language, and that is Daniel 12:1. I'm going to read Revelation 7:13 and 14 again, just so that you have that ringing in your head. Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, "Who are these, clothed in white robes, and where have they come?" I said to him, "Sir, you know." And he said to me, "These are the ones coming out of the Great Tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb." So let's take a look at the elements. Okay, we have Revelation 17, 13, 14. We just read that. It references a great tribulation. You're also going to get this language in the New Testament in Matthew 24:21. Let me just read that for you. We might as well read that. Again, this is an eschatological passage, part of the Olivet Discourse here. Pray that your fight, this is verse 20, pray that your flight might not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then, verse 21, there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. So like this is the ultimate, tribulation, okay? So you have this language in Revelation 7:13 and 14, Matthew 24:21. You have believers and martyrs on behalf of the Lamb who have gone through the Great Tribulation. That's Revelation 7. Okay, these are the ones who are coming out of the Great Tribulation. They've gone through the Great Tribulation. They're glorified because they have white robes. Their faith in the Lamb has saved them despite the Great Tribulation. Now, if the tribulation is at a close in Revelation 7, and basically all eschatological views are going to say that, then we're at the final day of the Lord judgment, which includes the great white throne, the book of life, and all that sort of stuff, because we got this glorification element and so on and so forth. Now, the context, Old Testament context. Here's Daniel 12:1. Just listen to Daniel 12:1 in light of Revelation 7, 13, and 14, and then Matthew 24:21. Here's Daniel 12:1. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation until that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. Okay, again, look at the elements and their overlap with Revelation 7:13 and 14 and Matthew 24:21. You have an end of days tribulation. There's no number assigned to it. Doesn't say it's 7 years, doesn't say it's anything. It's tribulation. And it's great because of the wording. Quote, this tribulation is such as never has been since there was a nation until that time. And because of that wording, scholars will link Daniel 12:1 to another Old Testament passage, Jeremiah 30, verse 7. I'll read that. Alas, that day is so great, there is none like it. It is a time of distress for Jacob, i.e. Israel. Yet he shall be saved out of it. Now, this is the passage where you get the phrase time of Jacob's trouble, which, again, certain end time systems will marry to the 7-year Great Tribulation and consider that the 70th week of Daniel. Again, there's certainly a connection there, but there's no number in any of these passages, and there's no association with the weeks of Daniel. Again, that's a problem for specific systems, all right? But you have an end of days tribulation, and it's great, again, because that's the way it's worded. There's like this, never have seen anything like this. It never will be again. Second element, the righteous are delivered, the people of God whose names are found written in the book. Okay, I think this is obviously the book of life. On here, to loop him in, he writes, part of a series of events associated with the arrival of the eschaton in early Judaism and early Christianity is in view here. I mean, this language in Revelation 7, 13, and 14 gets picked up in Second Temple Jewish literature. Okay, I say picked up because scholars think its source is Daniel 12, and Jeremiah 30, and so on and so forth. For instance, you get Testament of Moses 8:1, Jubilees 23:11 through 21, 4th Ezra 13, 16, and 19, the second apocalypse of Baruch 27, 1 through 15. There are other, again, Jewish texts in the Second Temple period that pick up on these passages and talk about them in kind of the same ways that you're also going to see in Revelation 7, 13, and 14. So even ancient people associated this language from Daniel 12:1 and Jeremiah 37, with the apocalypse. And of course, Revelation is an apocalypse, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of agreement here in terms of the ancient literature. Where there's disagreement is how modern end times systems, what they do with this and sort of information that gets added along the way. Now, Ahn also writes this: since the Danielic phrase "time of distress," this time of trouble, was interpreted as the time of the battle against the Kittim, that means Westerners, in 1 QM, that's the War Scroll, 1, 11, and 12, and chapter 15, verse 1. Since that's true, Bauckham suggests that the phrase, quote, "those who emerge from the Great Tribulation," here in Revelation 7, 13, and 14, means, quote, "those who emerge victorious from the eschatological war," okay, unquote. Ahn continues and says, it appears that while the Great Tribulation belonged to a discrete series of events in Jewish eschatological expectation, early Christians regarded their frequent experience of persecution and opposition as part of this eschatological period of tribulation presaging the end. And preterists like that because that's essentially the preterist argument, at least in terms of the flavor of it. Now, Beale, and who's not a preterist, but Beale is going to express these ideas this way. He says, Daniel 12:1 is acknowledged as the likely origin for the idea of the Great Tribulation. Quote, "There will be a time of tribulation, such tribulation as has not come about from when a nation was on earth until that time." That Daniel is in mind is also apparent from the fact that the phrase Great Tribulation occurs in the New Testament outside Revelation only in Matthew 24:21, where it is part of a fuller and more explicit reference to Daniel 12:1. He references Mark 13:19. He also references the War Scroll, so on and so forth, for these ideas. These are prophecies that God will protect the Israelite saints as they pass through the imminent, unprecedented time of distress prophesied in Daniel 12:1, after which they will be rewarded with eternal blessing. In Daniel's tribulation, the eschatological opponent persecutes the saints because of their covenant loyalty to God. That's Daniel 11:30 through 39, verse 44, and also Daniel 12:10. Some will apostatize and persecute those remaining loyal, especially attempting to cause them to forsake their loyalty. Therefore, the tribulation consists of pressures to compromise the faith, these pressures coming both from within the church community through seductive teaching and from without through overt oppression. Sometimes the persecution is economically oriented. So you have thlipsis, the word tribulation in Revelation 2:9, to afflict. You get the same thing in Leviticus 26:26 in the Septuagint, where it refers to a famine of bread and distributing loaves by weight, which stands partly behind, in Beale's mind, Revelation 6:5 through 6. At other times, the tribulation is heightened to include imprisonment and even death, Revelation 2:10, thlipsis, tribulation. Whatever its nature, tribulation always comes because of believers' faithful witness to Jesus. The greatness of the tribulation, therefore, and again in Beale's thinking, is the intensity of the seduction and the intensity of the oppression through which believers pass. Now, another item here. If Revelation 3:10 is an allusion to Daniel 12:1, let's read Revelation 3:10. We'll go back there. We've hit this before. "Because you have kept my word about patient endurance, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world to try those who dwell on the earth." So if that's an allusion to Daniel 12:1, which would then be connected to Revelation 7, 13, and 14, then one could argue, now catch this, one could argue that the Great Tribulation is yet another already but not yet element in biblical thought. Because Revelation 3 is addressed to the churches that are already boots on the ground. Okay, if Revelation 3:10 refers to Daniel 12:1, the writer sees this happening already, but then you're going to get these later passages where it's not yet. It's still something prospective. So the tribulation itself, this great end times tribulation, whatever it is, again, that people assume is the 70th week of Daniel, even though there's no textual support for that. Whatever that is, could be an already but not yet thing in the mind of the writer of Revelation. And that's actually Beale's position. Here's what he writes, just before we wrap up here. Indeed, the author of 1 Maccabees 9:27 understood that the great tribulation of Daniel 12:1 had already begun in the 2nd century BC, as a result of the chaos produced by Judas's death at the hands of Israel's enemy. This is Judas Maccabee. He writes, this is the writer of Maccabees 9:20, 1 Maccabees 9:27. So there was a great tribulation, thlipsis megale, in Israel, the like of which had not occurred since the time that a prophet was not seen among them. Unquote. Midrash of Psalm 119:31 applies Daniel 12:10 tribulation prophecy to the afflictions of Israel throughout history. Okay, so, on and on and on. He lists a few other examples here, and he writes, we have seen that the hour of testing in Revelation 3:10 also alludes to Daniel 12:1 and Daniel 12:10, so he thinks they are connected, and that it appears to include the entire time before Jesus' ministry and the parousia, again, the second coming. If so, the present analysis of the tribulation in Revelation 7:14 is supported further, though others also see a parallel between 3:10 and 7:14. But see both as alluding to something in the future, a final trial at the very end of history. So what Beale is arguing is that could be already, but not yet. And again, that's where he lands because, Maccabees picks up the language and some other sources already. Again, the people of God are under oppression all the way a couple centuries BC, all the way through the 1st century when John is writing the book of Revelation. It's already, but it's not yet. It's already happening. Believers are under oppression, but not yet. At the end, the ultimate consummation of this persecution, this tribulation, has yet to come. So at the very least, let's just wrap up this way. At the very least, here's what can be said about the great tribulation of Revelation 7:13 and 14 in biblical thought. Number one, it's certainly connected to Daniel 12:1 and Jeremiah 37. I don't think there's any way to deny that. Number two, it's therefore linked to Matthew 24:21. Number three, it is a time that precedes the final judgment and return of Jesus. Remember the white robes, okay, the book of life. So it's a time that precedes that, and it involves persecution of believers. That's number four. That's about what you can say about the Great Tribulation for sure. Notice there's no reference to weeks. There's no time. There's no number of years. All of that kind of stuff is supplied or kept from being part of the equation by whatever your end time system happens to be. So we shouldn't be making assumptions that the Great Tribulation is the 70th week of Daniel. Hey, maybe that's the way it'll turn out. Who knows? Okay. But there isn't a verse to hang that on, is the point. Rather, it might be this already but not yet thing, again, which wouldn't necessarily exclude the former. But again, it'd be sure nice to have a verse for that numerical equation, but we don't have it. So again, ultimately, this is what you're left with. This is why we have different end time systems. This is why if you love one and you need this element in it for it to work, you're going to cheat. You're just going to say it and that works. And now we move on to the next point. If you don't like, that eschatological system, you're going to say there's not even room for discussing this. Forget it. Blah 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 blah. You're going to dismiss it from the realm of possibility just out of the gate. It's a non-discussion item. And so there you go. This is how systems work. Both sides are going to do this at different points to make their system beautiful. And they're all beautiful, except where they're not. Okay, they're all beautiful until something messes with them. Which is why in this series, we're not propping up an end times system. Okay, I just want you to be thinking about Old Testament antecedents to these ideas, to the content here of Revelation 7 here in part 2. So again, possible connection, again, to Genesis 6, i.e. the Book of the Watchers stuff, the way that's worded, the way that was taken in Second Temple Judaism, the way that was understood. And you've got the Danite problem, the great eschatological enemy. Does he have a relationship to Dan? Okay, that's again, there's data there for that, but again, we don't necessarily know for sure. And then third, the Great Tribulation. All these things have Old Testament precedent antecedents. And that's what we're trying to do in this series of the podcast. Just introduce you to these things so that you can think about them when you're studying, in this case, the book of Revelation.